Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Josh Orlasky, and I'm a senior financial management major from Temecula, California. It is my honor to introduce our next speaker. Larry Elder is a radio and television host, author, and attorney. He earned his BA at Brown University and his JD at the University of Michigan. His daily radio program, The Larry Elder Show, was first broadcast in 1994, making it the longest-running afternoon drive time show in Los Angeles. Mr. Elder is the director and producer of Michael and Me, a documentary film that examines the history and use of guns in America. He is a former host of the television shows Moral Court and The Larry Elder Show. For his work on television, he received an Aegis Award of Excellence, a Telly Award, and an Emerald City Gold Award of Excellence. He's the author of numerous books, including What's Race Got to Do with It? Why It's Time to Stop the Stupidest Argument in America. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Larry Elder.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Before I get started, any active or retired military, please stand. Bless you. Bless you. God bless you. Let me give you the Cliff Notes version of how I got into talk radio and into media. But for Dennis Prager, I wouldn't be here. I was on Dennis Prager's show, and the general manager heard me, liked me, gave me a 2-day audition. After one day, he said, if you want this job, you have it. Go out tonight, have a good time, don't speak so quickly. But before that, I was living and working in Cleveland. This is about 2 years earlier when I got the bug to do radio. I was writing op-ed pieces, and every now and then one would get published. I had no publisher. I wasn't syndicated at the time. I just wrote pieces and would send them blindly to newspapers. The two newspapers in the Northeast Ohio area were the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Akron Beacon Journal, and every now and then one would be published. And I wrote one that was published in the Plain Dealer where I talked about how racism was no longer a major problem in America. This is almost 25 years ago. Revolutionary thing to say now, let alone then. I got a phone call from a producer of a radio show. He said, would you mind coming on tonight and talking about your article? Do you truly believe that racism is no longer a major problem in America? And I said, yes. I don't say racism is gone. It'll never be gone. As long as there are idiots and morons, we're always going to have some problems. But do I believe that racism is strong enough in the current year to stop anybody willing to work hard, stay focused? Hell no. He said, great. Come on the show. Cleveland is about 60% black, so almost all the phone calls I got were from black people. And I was called an Uncle Tom, a bootlicking Uncle Tom, a bug-eyed, foot-shuffling bootlicking Uncle Tom, an Oreo, brown on the outside, white on the inside, coconut, same concept, the Antichrist, and then I was called the name that you call a black man when you really, really, really want to hurt him. I was called Republican. A man can only take so much. So I was determined never to do that again. I'm driving back to work. This is the most wasteful hour of my entire life. I get into my office, phone rings. It's the general manager of the station where I just was. He said, you were amazing. I was? Oh my goodness, you were on for an entire hour? You took difficult positions, you defended them without losing your sense of humor? Have you ever thought about doing talk radio? I said, no. He said, I have a guy going on vacation. I'd love for you to sit in for him for that week. I said, no. He said, why? I said, I don't like it. He said, why don't you like it? I said, I don't like being yelled at. I don't like having others yell at me. He said, are you married? At the time I was. He said, do me a favor, go home and talk this over with your wife. I think you may have a different attitude tomorrow. I said, I'm happy to do that, but I won't change my mind. Went home that night, I mentioned it to my then wife, Cindy, and she said, what do you think about talk radio? I said, I know very little about it, other than it seems shallow, glib, and stupid. She said, it is. You'd be good at it. Gives you some idea what happened to that marriage. I am fascinated by this idea that President Obama said that racism was in America's DNA. Incredible statement. You look at the polls in 1950, in the 50s, when white Americans were asked, would you ever vote for a black person for president? Those who said yes were in the single digits. How can racism be in our DNA if 50 years later, 60 years later, a black man gets elected president of the United States of America? It's not possible. if racism is in our DNA. Obama, in my opinion, in 8 years did a great deal of damage to race relations. Came in with a great deal of hope. Do you remember the polls after he got elected? He was at 70%. That's more than the people who voted for him, which shows people were pulling for him. And they were pulling for him because they thought he could bring the nation together, at least as far as race relations are concerned. The first time I saw Obama was in 2004. I was in Boston, in the arena, when he did the warm-up speech for John Kerry. He lit the place up. I turned to my producer and I said, this guy's going to run for president someday. He's going to get elected. He didn't say anything. There's no blue country, there's no red country, there's just the United States of America. Anybody could have given that speech, but he gave it well. I saw his first interview on 60 Minutes. He interviewed Steve Croft. This is before he became president, when he was running. At this point, he had now begun to get momentum and take it away from Hillary. And Steve Croft said to him, Senator, if you don't get the nomination, will it be because of racism? And I said, let's see how this guy answers. And he said, no. If I don't get the nomination, it will be because I have failed to articulate a vision that the American people can accept. I said, hallelujah. I'm not going to vote for a left-wing tax spend regulate person, but at least he's not a victocrat. At least he's not whining and bitching and moaning about how the white man is holding him back. I was stunned. He gets in, and he undid everything he did in that interview with Steve Croft, in my opinion. The first time he had a chance to say something conciliatory to heal this nation was when the Cambridge police went to the house of his friend, Henry Louis Gates. You might remember the incident. Gates was coming back from vacation, forgot his door key. So he and the cab driver broke into his own house. Some lady in the neighborhood saw it, called 911. Don't you want that? I want neighbors to do that. Police show up, go to his house, very politely ask him to come out of the house. They have no idea who he is, whether or not he broke into the house. And rather than come out and politely show his ID, Skip Gates, this tenured Harvard professor, said, I'll come out if your mama tells me, or something like that. I mean, really? Really? What did Obama say? And I quote, the Cambridge police acted stupidly, close quote. He got hammered so much, that's why he did that stupid beer summit. Trayvon Martin. If I had a son, Obama said, he would have looked like Trayvon. What does that even mean? What's the point in injecting yourself in this anyway? Fast forward, jury, criminal trial, found him not guilty. There was one black alternate who didn't participate, but when asked, he said, I would have reached the same conclusion. Race never came up during the jury deliberations. Ferguson. Obama's giving a speech before the United Nations, and he says, well, we have our own problems here too. There's a town called Ferguson. He went on and did a riff about how Ferguson is a microcosm of the problems America has in race. And you know what happened. Grand jury found the officer completely not guilty. The Justice Department examined it and determined that while this man did not do anything wrong, the Ferguson Police Department is institutionally racist. Why? Well, the city is 67% black, but 85% of the traffic stops are of black people, 18-point gap, ergo racism. Really? New York has 25% black people. 55% of the traffic stops of people are black, a 30-point difference. Yet the New York Police Department, at least the street cops, are predominantly people of color, while the Ferguson PD is almost all white. How can one that's predominantly people of color have a bigger gap in traffic stops than the one that's all white, unless they're both racist? The answer is you can't do it by that. You have to look at rates of offending. And about 2 years before this happened, there was a Department of Justice study by the National Institutes of Justice, which is their research arm, called Traffic Stops and Race. And it turned out every offense, you name it, whether it's speeding, driving without a license, driving without a seatbelt, driving without a proper tags, whatever the offense is, a black person was more likely to commit it. So the National Institutes of Justice, the research arm of the DOJ, wrote a paper about it and said the differences in traffic stops have to do with differences in offending. In other words, they found no racism. Some years ago at the New Jersey Turnpike, a lot of blacks were complaining that they were being pulled over because of racial profiling. The then Governor Christie Todd Whitman ordered a study. Study came back, and the researchers found out that by and large, they couldn't find anything wrong. Often these stops took place at night where the cars were going so fast and it's dark you couldn't tell who was in it anyway, what race they were anyway. And they found nothing. She didn't like the conclusions. She hired another group to do a different study using different methodology. They reached the same conclusion. Sorry. No one says racism doesn't exist, but for crying out loud, this twisting over backwards to try and prove things that don't exist when there are real things. It's interesting when people talk about things like institutional racism. They never mention things like the minimum wage. The first minimum wage was in 1938. It was 25 cents. A paper by the Cato Institute, the libertarian think tank out of Washington, D.C., concludes that because of the minimum wage and other measures done by FDR during the New Deal, blacks over a period of years lost probably about 500,000 jobs. At one time, a black teen was the most likely to be employed as between a white teen, white male, black male. Think about it, they had less skills, and they were able to offer their talents, whatever they were, for less money. Along comes the government and requires employers to pay a minimum wage, therefore shutting out people willing to work for less money, and these are people usually with fewer skills. There's a law that was also started during the Depression called the Davis-Bacon Act. Davis-Bacon were two Republicans, and they wanted to make sure that union members were not outcompeted by blacks willing to work for less money. So they passed a law called the Davis-Bacon Act, which requires anybody bidding on a government contract to pay, quote, prevailing union wages, close quote. In other words, wages white people will accept. It was specifically designed to foreclose competition from blacks. The only reason I think the Democrats never mentioned this, because there are two Republicans that did it, is because the pro-union part outweighs the racism part. So as a result, Democrats almost never bring it up. Fascinating. Getting back to Obama, I read his book, his first book. And in his first book, he describes his meeting of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. He says Wright was late to the church. So he got there and began having a discussion with Wright's longtime secretary, a single mom with a son in high school. And she told Obama that her son wants to be in the marching band, and his school does not have a marching band. However, there's a suburban school that has a marching band, predominantly white suburban school, that not only has a marching band, but also has free uniforms. So she was thinking of moving to that area so her son could have a better education. And Jeremiah Wright was trying to talk her out of it. And Obama said, why? And she said, Jeremiah Wright believes that my son won't know who he is as a black person if he lives in a predominantly white neighborhood, end of quote. Now, think about the person to whom she's telling this. This is a half-white man whose white mother sent him back to Hawaii so that he could be raised by his white grandparents because she wanted to make sure he got a better education. He ended up going to Punahou, the state's most prestigious private institution boarding school. And then he went to Occidental College in LA for the first 2 years, a very selective, expensive private school. Finished up at Columbia, and then of course graduated at Harvard. The man never set foot in a public school. And yet, when Obama and his wife were considering going to Washington, D.C. after he got elected, she made a big display out of talking about all the public schools that they visited. And I went on the air and I said, I'll be a cross-dressing cosmonaut if Obama chooses a public school. He didn't. He sent his girls to Sidwell Friends, the same school that Chelsea went to. Very, very expensive. Yet this is a man who runs a party that opposes vouchers. The ability to take the money and use the money to give your child a better education. Do you know in Baltimore there are 5 public high schools where not a single child can do math and read at state proficiency levels, which aren't that high in the first place. Not a single one. There's a middle school where not a single child can do math and can read at state levels of proficiency. Yet again, this is a party that adamantly opposes vouchers. Why 95% of black people go in and pull the lever for a party that says, I don't care whether or not your kid is going to go to an underperforming public school, and I don't care that you don't care. He's going. How somebody can pull a lever for that party is beyond me. If there is a route to the middle class, what is it other than education? What is it? And you're telling me that I've got to send my kid to a school? I went to a school called Crenshaw High School. Anybody see the movie Boys in the Hood? Okay, that's the school that I went to, and the movie was about an urban high school and a bunch of kids, and The school right now is said to be a Crip school. There are two major black gangs in LA, the Bloods and the Crips. And schools will adopt a gang or gangs will adopt a school. The Crips have adopted my school. The reason I know that is because Ice-T, the rapper, went there about 10 years later and told me. I read an article in the LA Times a few years ago, 3 years ago I believe it was, front page article. 3% of the kids at my former high school can do math and can do reading at grade level. And that's up from 2% the year before. And we want to talk about institutional racism? Blows my mind. Blows my mind. I understand the feud that Donald Trump is having right now with Jay-Z. You hear about that? Jay-Z said something very critical about Obama, about Trump, and Trump tweeted, well, black unemployment is at an all-time low. And Jay-Z said something to the effect of, well, money isn't everything. It's about how people are treated. An easy thing to say when you have a net worth of $800 million, isn't it? Isn't it similar to what Nancy Pelosi and Debbie Wasserman Schultz have said about the tax cuts? Chump change, crumbs, doesn't amount to very much. Nancy Pelosi has a net worth of over $200 million. I suppose it is crumbs to her. But to regular, normal people, it's food on the table. I had Tavis Smiley on my show once, and he had Cornel West with him, who used to call himself a Marxist. He has another fancy name now, but they were both in the studio, so it was a fair fight. And I said, Tavis, during the Reagan years, black adult unemployment fell faster than did white adult unemployment. Hispanic unemployment fell faster than did white unemployment. Black teenage unemployment fell faster than did white teenage unemployment. All because Ronald Reagan cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28%. You put money in the pockets of producers and they produce. Tavis said, that's not true. Those numbers are wrong. I'll have the correct numbers for you on Monday. That was 6 years ago. I know our postal service can be sluggish, but come on. The refusal to give Ronald Reagan any credit, it's just stunning. This President Obama did the opposite of what Ronald Reagan did. Reagan cut taxes dramatically, Obama raised them. Reagan continued the deregulation programs that had been begun under Jimmy Carter, one of the few things Jimmy Carter did that I approve. And he slowed down the rate. He slowed down the size of government Trump has by not producing some of these vacancies that we never needed in the first place. This is the first president that's really truly cut down the size of government staff in my lifetime. And I'm unbelievably impressed by that. I have often been asked why it is that I am so optimistic, why it is I'm so positive. And it's from my parents. I had great parents, my mother and my father. I remember my mother was from Huntsville, Alabama, and she told me that in the South there was a chimney maker. He was black, couldn't neither read nor write, but he was the most employed person in the South, black or white, because he could build chimneys that didn't smoke. And she said it wasn't because the white people in the country invited him in for dinner. They needed his skills. Booker T. Washington said, whenever a Negro boy learns to cook, to sew, to practice medicine as well as or better than anybody else, he or she will be rewarded because the world wants the best. My mother told me that when she grew up, there were two theaters, a country theater and the downtown theater. The downtown theater had first-run movies. The country theater had second-run movies. They were both owned by white men, two different white men. In the downtown theater, you could go if you were black, but you had to sit on the balcony. You couldn't sit downstairs. In the country theater, you could sit anywhere you wanted. Suddenly, and the country theater only had second-run movies. The downtown theater had first-run movies. So kids went to the downtown theater in order to see movies that they would not be able to see for 6 months or a year in the country theater. All of a sudden, the theater owner in the country began getting first-run movies. Guess what happened to the downtown theater and their anti-sitting-at-the-floor policy? They changed it like that. There was no law. There was no picket, there was no march. the guy started losing money. And all of a sudden, it was no longer unacceptable. It was no longer acceptable for blacks to sit in the balcony. The point I'm making, of course, is that invest in yourself. Make yourself of value to the community. And the way you do that is through hard work, self-investment, self-improvement, and education. There's no other route. If there is, I'd have found it. My father and I did not get along. I couldn't stand the SOB. I thought he was mean, I thought he was gruff, I thought he was ornery, and the thing about him that bothered me the most is whatever he was mean or gruff or ornery about wasn't necessarily the same thing the second time. So he's unpredictable. He seemed like he would come home and just be smoldering. We never even liked him in the house. My father was a janitor, and then he saved his nickels and dimes and started a cafe. Oh, great, now we all have to work with him. So I'm working with my dad, and from the time I was 10 years old to the time I was 15 years old, I hated every day of it. My dad worked me harder than anybody else, held me to a higher standard than anybody else. And every now and then, when things would really get tense during rush hour, 11:30 to 1 o'clock, my dad would curse at me if I did something he thought was wrong. Now, I was afraid of my father. I'd like to tell you that I told myself the next time he curses at me, I'm going to walk up to him and I'm going to say, "See here, pal, let's have it out right now." But I was afraid of him. So I told myself the next time he yells at me, I'm out of here. I was going to leave. You just don't do that. The waitress called in sick that day. Now, I'm talking about a little cafe, 16, 18 seats. Waitress called in that day. She was sick. So my dad and I were just working together. And my dad cursed at me. I went in the back. I took the robe off. And I left. My dad came home that night. The restaurant was full of people, by the way. He was furious. "Why did you leave?" And I said, "I got tired of the way you spoke to me." My dad paid me $10 a day plus tips. He took the $10 out of his pocket, balled it up, and threw it at me. He walked out of my bedroom. My dad and I did not speak for 10 years. And when I say didn't speak, I mean nothing. He came home late, so it was easy to avoid him. When I graduated from college, from high school, I went away to college in the East Coast, so we didn't see each other. And then when I would come home over the years, I would make sure we didn't talk. So for 10 years, my dad and I said nothing to each other. And by nothing, I mean not even, do you think it's going to rain? How are those Rams going to do? Nothing. Now I'm 25 years old. I've gone to college. I've gone to law school. Now I'm working for a prominent firm in Cleveland, and I can't sleep. I'm not quite sure why, but I think it has something to do with unresolved issues with my dad. I don't know. So I called my secretary and I said, "Cancel all my appointments. I'm going to LA. I didn't tell my parents I was coming because I didn't want my dad to prepare for this confrontation. I figured it'd last 5 minutes. I would call him a mean, ornery dad. He'd call me an ungrateful son. At least we'd clear the air. So I got there. I had 2 big bags. I said, "Dad, I want to talk to you." He was stopped. He said, "Sure, should I put your bags in the back?" I said, "No, Dad, I'm only going to be here for about 5 minutes. He said, "Well, you know what time we close? In an hour. And I'll come out and we'll talk then." So I sat there for an hour, and I'm watching the cafe. And I said, "All right, Larry, stay calm. Don't tee off on the SOB. Just articulate a few high points, and then he'll call you an ungrateful son. At least you guys would have discussed it. Maybe you'll be able to sleep better." So Dad sat down, and of course, I teed off on him. I spoke for 20 minutes nonstop. I guess you guys can see how I can go. Every whipping, every spanking, every slight, every indignity, anything he ever said to me, I talked to him about it. I just hit him with it. And my dad just took it. Every now and then he'd pour more coffee, but he just took it. And then I ran out of ammo. And my dad looked up and he goes, "Is that it? You didn't speak to me for 10 years because of that?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Let me tell you about my father." Now keep in mind, I knew my dad was an only child, and I had met his mother once. Outside of that, I knew nothing about him and didn't care. I knew he had no relatives because nobody ever came over, nobody ever called for him, we never got any Christmas presents from anybody, so I knew that he was an only child, that's all I knew, and I didn't really care much beyond that. My dad said, I'm 25 years old now. "You know your name, Elder?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That is not my biological father."
What?
Elder is a man who was in my mom's life, he said, probably the longest. He was an alcoholic who was physically abusive to her, physically abusive to me. He may work sometime. When he did work, he'd come home, bring the check, give it to her, tell her to keep it. By Wednesday, he'd want the money. She wouldn't give it to him. He beat the crap out of her. If I intervened, he beat the crap out of me. She had a series of boyfriends like that, my dad said, one worse than the other. The first time I saw my dad cry, we were talking about this man. And my dad said he came home at the age of 13, and he was quarreling with his mom's then boyfriend, a different man. The mom sided with the boyfriend, threw my father out of the house, never to return. You're talking about a black boy, Jim Crow South, right at the beginning of the Great Depression. He never went back home. Walked down the road, took whatever job he could, Pullman porter, shoe shine boy, you name it. Ultimately, he got a job as a Pullman porter, which was a big deal. They were the largest private employer of blacks in those days, so my dad was able to travel all around the country. And he came to California, and it was sunny, and people seemed a little more friendly. My dad thought maybe someday I'll relocate to California. World War II, Pearl Harbor, my dad joins the Marines. My dad was a Montford Point Marine. They were the first black Marines. There were 20,000 of them. Congress a few years ago gave them a Congressional Gold Medal. My dad got his posthumously. I said, Dad, why the Marines? He said, they go where the action is, and I love the uniforms. They made him a cook. In charge of cooking facilities, he became a staff sergeant on the island of Guam. The bombs fell. My dad went back to Chattanooga, where he had met and married my mom. And now with all this experience as a cook, my dad wanted to get him a job as a cook. He goes to restaurant to restaurant to restaurant in Chattanooga, and he's told, we don't hire niggers. My dad went to an unemployment office. The lady says, you went through the wrong door. My dad goes out, sees colored only, goes through that door to the very same woman who sent him out. My dad went home to my mother and said, this is BS, I'm going to California. And he goes out to California. He says, I'm gonna spend a couple of days, I'm gonna find a job, and then I'll send for you. So my dad walked around for about a day and a half, restaurant to restaurant to restaurant in California, 1946. And he's told, you don't have any references, which is California's way of saying the same thing, they were just more polite. My dad said, I'll work for free, just give me a reference after 2 weeks. They wouldn't even do that. My dad goes to an unemployment office, this time just one door. They have nothing. My dad said, I'll take the first thing you have. She sat there for a day and a half. Lady calls him up, I have a job, don't know if you'll want it. My dad said, I'm sure I'll want it, what is it? She said, it's a job at Nabisco brand breads cleaning toilets. My dad took that job for 10 years, took a second job at Barbara Ann Bread for 10 years, also cleaning toilets, cooked for a family on the weekends, and went to night school 2 to 3 nights a week to get his GED. The man never slept, which is why he was tired, why he was grouchy, why he was crotchety. And as my dad spoke, he got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I got smaller and smaller and smaller. And I said, Dad, I am so sorry. Please accept my apology. I didn't know. He said, you're a child. Of course you didn't know. But just follow the advice I've always given you and your brothers. Hard work wins. You get out of life what you put into it. You cannot control the outcome, but you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you moan and whine about what somebody did to you, go to the nearest mirror, look at it, and say, how could I have changed the outcome? And no matter what you do, no matter how thoroughly you follow my instructions, sooner or later, bad things will happen. How you respond to those bad things will tell your mother and me whether or not we raised a man. Not too much pressure, Dad. How much time we have? I want to give you a couple more stories. 10, 15 minutes. Okay. My mother and father were married 56 years. My mom was a lifelong Democrat. My dad was a lifelong Republican. You should have heard the arguments they had across the table. It was fascinating. During Watergate, my dad thought it was so inconsequential. So some people broke into the Watergate, and Richard Nixon covered it up, and therefore he should leave office. My mother said yes, and my dad said no. My dad even recommended that Nixon make new tapes with Haldeman and Ehrlichman and replace the old tapes. He thought it was that silly. Fast forward, look at the polls. Most Americans now believe he never should have resigned. Most Americans believe it was inconsequential, especially when you look at what's happened in the last 8 years. My goodness, Hillary has a server in her basement, sent and received classified information, denied it that she did, but she did. Burned 33,000 emails when they were under subpoena. My goodness, the tax-exempt person at the IRS is rejecting conservative applications. She takes the Fifth a bunch of times. Right now, she's in a nice home in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., collecting her pension. And Richard Nixon resigned because some people he had nothing to do with broke into the Watergate. My dad's instincts turned out to have been right. My mother began voting Republican. She voted twice for Reagan. She voted twice for Bush. I said, Mother, why have you not changed your registration? And she gave me some answer, and it turned out, the bottom line was, it was emotion. The Democrats have been so successful in branding Republicans as bad, mean-spirited, and racist. Even my mother, despite the fact of pulling the lever for the Republican Party all those years, still couldn't bring herself to re-register. It's amazing the reputation that the Democrats have. I was in New York for one of the conventions, had some press pass on, a white cab driver and I were talking, and I guess he assumed because I was black, I was a Democrat, and began ragging about the Republican Party. And I said, what's the difference in your opinion between the two parties? And he stopped, and he said, well, my father says that the Republican Party only cares about General Electric. The Democratic Party cares about you and me. I said, is it possible to have both? And all of a sudden, he stopped talking about politics. He realized that I wasn't a Democrat. I am amazed at this Trump derangement syndrome. Trump is the most moderate Republican president in my lifetime. He's a guy who came into office and said same-sex marriage is settled law. He supported the Kelo decision that most Republicans hated. That was a decision that allowed a private person to use a tax-exempt status that the government has in order to build something private, as opposed to for a school or a road or something like that. It was a 5-4 decision that most Republicans hated, and Donald Trump, a developer, supports it. Donald Trump's daughter says that there should be weeks of paid family and medical leave. What Republican says that? And this DACA deal that Trump put out, that would grant a pathway to citizenship for 1.8 million people, I can't imagine the Democrats getting a better deal. But they don't want it. The reason they don't want it, in my opinion, is because they want the borders to remain porous, because they can't win elections otherwise. The Democratic Party has lost the white vote since 1964. Unless the Democratic Party is successful in convincing people like you to tax, spend, and regulate, they need to bring in people who do want to tax, spend, and regulate, and these are people from third world countries. And it has gradually changed the nature of this country to the point where we have almost a 50-50 nation. And if we bring in millions of more people from third world countries who have the kinds of views I'm talking about, who don't have any understanding of the concept of federalism, any understanding of the concept of differences between church and state, no understanding of the concept of limited government, we're going to have more and more Democrats. And that's what they're doing. They are minting Democrats. I've asked this question. I sent a tweet one time to Wolf Blitzer, and I said, the next time you have on Luis Gutierrez, the congressman from Chicago, the most open borders guy up there, please ask him if he would oppose the wall if 80% of illegals turned citizens would vote Republican. I dare say they'd have a different attitude. Do you really believe that Democrats would be pushing for statehood of Washington, D.C. if it weren't likely that 2 more senators would be Democrat and at least 1 more congressperson would be Democrat? Does anybody really believe that people like Terry McAuliffe would want convicted felons to have the right to vote if they would not overwhelmingly likely vote the Democratic Party? So why then is it cynical of me, to say I don't want a bunch more Democrats pulling the lever to, in my opinion, vote against my interests and against the interests of the country? Why is that wrong? Why is that bad? I want to end with a couple of stories. Every now and then I'm just reminded of just how wonderful this country is. I was at a gas station maybe 6-8 months ago, pulled into my late model car given to me by one of my sponsors. I get out, I had a designer suit on, one of my sponsors. Credit card, substantial limit. I'm getting premium gas. Next to the bay, car pulls up, rumbling, a 1968 Dodge Polara with a busted muffler. 2 guys get out. Very, very pale, pasty skin. I can tell they're relatives by the way they look. It was out-of-state plate. I don't want to malign any states. I won't tell you what state it is, but collectively they might have had 8, 10 teeth between the 2 of them. They got $5 of regular, and they rumble off. And I said, wow, just think. Those 2 dudes owe me reparations. Is this a great country or what? Thank you. Last one, then we'll do Q&A. I took a course in high school called Afro-American Literature. Read a poem by a man named County Cullen, and it went like this. While riding through old Baltimore, so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep a looking straight at me. Now, I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. Well, the class was furious, teacher was furious, I was furious. The teacher talked about the permanent stain to his psyche, that he'll always consider himself to be a second-class citizen, that he'll never forget this. So I went home. I knew my mother was going to have a different take. I didn't know what it was going to be. And I walk in. She's in the kitchen. I'll never forget it, frying chicken. I said, Mom, we read a poem in class. I want to get your reaction to it. She said, sure. I said, it goes like this. While riding through old Baltimore, so small and full of glee, I saw a young Baltimorean keep a looking straight at me. Now, I was young and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled. But he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until September. Of all the things that happened there, that's all that I remember. My mother closed the door oven, turned to me, and she said, Larry, what a darn shame he let something so trivial spoil his vacation. How many wings do you want? Thank you so much for having me. May God bless you, and may God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elder. We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand, and a microphone will be brought to you.
Dude, your energy was killing me. You were like the sun over there. I believe these two guys got burned, didn't they? Okay.
Thank you, Larry, for coming to Hillsdale College to speak. My name is Doyle. I'm a sophomore. I liked your PragerU video on the problem of the lack of fatherhood in the black community. And so I heard this saying from conservatives that politics is downstream from our culture. But then from the readings of Aristotle, what he says is that culture is actually downstream from politics in terms of the way we make our laws. And so when solving the problem of the lack of fathers in the black community, how do we solve, which perspective should we use to solve that problem?
Okay. In 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, later on became a Democratic senator from New York, wrote a report called The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. I read the book when I was a freshman in college in 1970. And I was in a sociology class, I think, when I read it, and I was one of maybe 2 or 3 blacks in the class, and most of the whites in the class thought the book was racist, was demeaning, and that Moynihan was a patriarchal person. I'm the only one in the class that thought there was something there, and the kids thought I was bizarre. That was 1965. 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. Roughly 10 to 15% of white kids were born outside of wedlock. Fast forward, now 73% of black kids are born outside of wedlock. 25% of white kids are, the same number that triggered that alarming book, and 40% of Hispanic kids are born outside of wedlock. Now, why is this a problem? Don't take me, take Obama. Obama said, a kid raised without a dad is 5 times more likely to be poor, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in college. What else is there to say? It is far and away the #1 problem facing the black community. What, in my opinion, has happened is when Lyndon Johnson launched the war on poverty with the best of intentions, 50 years and $22 trillion later, this is the result. What we've done is we've incentivized women to marry the government. We've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. The answer is to end government welfare. And welfare should be done at the private sector level, the church level, nonprofits like United Way. I volunteered for United Way for 3 months once. We do a lot of work for Food for the Poor. Organizations, cut taxes, let people use their own money and donate their own money, and the money will be donated in a way that's more efficient and much more likely to change behavior, even if it's just on a level of efficiency. Tom Sowell, the economist, says that for every dollar that taxpayers spend on welfare, about 33 cents gets down to the intended beneficiary. For organizations like United Way, 95 cents on the dollar gets down to the intended beneficiary because so many people are volunteers. So the answer is to unhook people from the welfare state. And don't go by me, go by what they say themselves. In 1986, the LA Times did a survey of poor and non-poor people and asked, do you feel that welfare is a crutch or is it a stopgap to get you on your own 2 feet? The majority of people majority of poor people, 64%, thought it was a crutch and that it was a trap. That was 1986. They've done the same survey years later in 2006, and as many poor people thought it was a crutch as thought it was a stepping stone to get you on your own 2 feet. So there's a debate even within the class of people we call poor as to whether or not government welfare really works. It's a problem. Most people in this room probably read Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Most people probably have not read another book he wrote around the same time called Memoirs on Pauperism. He had money. He was able to travel around the world. And he noticed that the wealthiest country, England, seemed to have the most beggars, most street people. And it turns out that England was the first modern state to have a welfare, no questions asked welfare. And as a result, you had more and more beggars coming there. And he concluded that there was a connection between offering people free money and laziness, but he didn't know what to do about it because there are certain people that need help, and you can't look at somebody and tell which ones need help, which ones don't. So he says it's a dilemma. It still is a dilemma, but the first part of the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. We are doing harm by saying, here's free money to you, irrespective of your behavior, irrespective of the decision that you've made, irrespective of the decision that you make in the future, you're still going to get this money. That is morally wrong.
Hi, Mr. Elder, I'm John. Statistically, most people get their political views from what their parents think. As a person who grew up with parents who differ politically, how'd you come into your views?
One of the things that happened to me, and I get that question a lot, was there some kind of epiphany? There wasn't. It was gradual. But I took a course in economics. How many people have taken a course in economics? Your life is different after that. You can't look at minimum wage and you go, oh, no. You can't. You can't look at zoning laws and say, oh, these things have prices, these things have costs, supply and demand, inflation. Once you read these kinds of things, you realize how nutty the left is. They really believe that you can jack up the minimum wage without any adverse consequences. Then why are we futzing around at $15? Make it $50. That way everybody gets $100,000. If you honestly believe there are no adverse effects, then jack it up. I'm sorry?
Make it the congressional wage.
That's right. Sounds good. $175,000, I think. Plus benefits. The reason I know is that I thought about running for Congress. Real quick story. I have been asked to run for everything up to and including president. In fact, this is an interesting story. I have a friend named Tim Grosclose. He is a professor, was at UCLA, now he's at George Mason University. Larry, I want you to come over to my house. This is about a year before the election. Got all these graphs, all these papers on his desk. He's an economist and a political science professor. He said, Larry, run for president, you could win. I said, whatever you're smoking, I suggest you put it out. He said, you could win. I said, I've never held office. I have no experience. He says, let me tell you how. He went over the thing. He outlined almost to a T what Trump did. Almost to a T. I'm not saying I would have done it, but I was prevailed to run for Senate against Barbara Boxer in California. And because I cannot stand her politics, this time some people came to me with serious money, serious clout, serious people, and I said, if I get the nomination, I'll run against her. So I go to Washington, D.C. on my own dime, and I meet with all of these members of the Congressional Committee to recruit Senate candidates. John Cornyn and others. Larry, tell me about your family. So I told him about my family, my dad, and stuff I told you guys, and he was really fascinated by it. I met 4 or 5 other senators. They all seemed to be fascinated by my story, fascinated by it. I knew I had it. I get back to LAX, phone rings. We're going with Carly Fiorina. I said, why? 3 reasons. She's a woman. I said, I'll give you that. Number 2, she has more money than you do. I'll give you that. Number 3, she has higher name recognition than you do. Oh, no, she doesn't. She may have higher name recognition in the halls of Washington, D.C., but not in California. The reason I know that is because a friend of mine put my name on a poll to find out what my popularity was, and at that juncture, I had a 35% known factor in California. At the same period of time, her first opponent named Bruce Hershenson had a 5% name recognition at that time. Her second opponent, Matt Fong, had a 5% name recognition. So my name recognition is 7 times higher than her first 2 opponents, and I haven't even gotten warmed up yet. You guys are wrong. Anyway, they went with her, and I decided not to do it. I could have still run in the primary, but I would have had to raise money to defeat her, and then run in the general, and I just didn't want to do it. And if they weren't interested in being enthusiastic about me, then I'm not interested in being enthusiastic about you. It's a rough, tough grind. You have to be on the phone all day raising money in a state like California. To run and win in California, you're talking about raising at least $150 million, if you're going to be serious. $150 million. And almost all of it is TV and radio media. And if you don't have that kind of jack and get the backing behind the Republican Party, you have no hope. Yes, sir.
Yes, no, my name is Richard. I'm a fellow Brown University alum.
All right.
We've got several of us in the audience and many more live streaming you. We just wanted to tell you how proud we are of you and to ask how you're feeling about Brown, which was once, I guess, the bastion of free speech and intellectual honesty, and now perhaps a little overboard
Just
on
a little.
political correctness and free
Just a
speech
little, yeah.
zones and whatever. So
Well,
thanks for coming.
My pleasure, and thank you so much for that. Look, Brown is just like the rest of the Ivies. They're all like that. If there's an Ivy that's more conservative, I don't know which one it is. They're all like that. We're talking about racism. When I was at Brown, I think it was Honig who was president. I'm sitting there, and then, a few decades later, a black woman became president at Brown. And we're still talking about institutional racism. Speaking of which, let me just, another quick thing about that. Freddie Gray died in the police van in Baltimore. It's one of the deaths that helped to spawn this so-called Black Lives Matter movement. Baltimore is a city that's about 45% black. City council is 100% Democrat, majority black. At the time of Freddie Gray's death, the number 1 in the department was black. Number 2 in the department is black. Mayor is black. The state attorney who brought the charges against 6 officers, black. 3 of the 6 officers, black. The judge who presided over 2 of the cases and pronounced the cops not guilty, black. U.S. attorney, of course, black. And the president, black. President, U.S. attorney, mayor, top 2 people in the PD, 3 of the 6 officers black, state attorney black, the judge who ruled on 2 of the cases black, and we're talking about institutional racism when blacks are running the institution? Isn't there something wrong here? I gave a talk at Ohio State University for the football team, even though I went to Michigan. I got a phone call from a text from Coach Urban Meyer, and with his phone number, and he wanted me to come to the school and give a speech because he said, I know how you feel because your show is carried here in Columbus, and I had a speaker last month who was a Black Lives Matter proponent and got everybody all upset, and I want you to give another point of view. He said, I'm not going to tell you what I think. I don't get into that, but I do want to have your point of view. So I went there on my own dime. And I said, according to Washington Post in 2015, 965 people were killed by the police. Less than 4% were black men, unarmed, killed by a white cop. Last year, there were 17 unarmed black men killed by a cop. And by the way, unarmed does not mean not dangerous. Michael Brown was unarmed, and he was still charging towards the officer. They found his DNA on the officer's gun. So just because you're not armed doesn't mean you're not dangerous, but 17 unarmed. By contrast, 300 people were injured by lightning last year. Now, they don't keep tabs as to race, but let's assume that lightning kind of did it proportionately, which meant 7% of the country is black male. That means 21 black men were injured by lightning. You are more likely to be injured by lightning as a black male than to be an unarmed black man killed by the cops. It is rare. It almost never happens. And it turns out that there are at least 2 studies that suggest cops are more reluctant to pull the trigger against a black suspect than a white suspect, probably because the fear of being called a racist and perhaps even losing your pensions if you get convicted of some sort of crime that you feel you shouldn't have been convicted of. So what cops are doing because of the Black Lives Matter thing, they're pulling back. So crime is up in Chicago. Crime is up in St. Louis, which is right outside Ferguson. The very people that the Black Lives Matter claim that they care about are the ones that are more likely to be hurt by an increase in crime, and these are urban blacks. Well done, guys. Well done.
Thank you again for coming to speak, Mr. Elder. Regarding the civil rights movement, what is the best way by which to convince people that the civil disobedience of Martin Luther King was more effective at bringing societal change than the militant protestations of Malcolm X?
Well, I think you just look at what's happened over the last several decades and see that King clearly was right. Let me say something about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement jumped the track when people went from demanding equal rights to demanding equal results. Those are 2 very different things. And what I found puzzling about Obama, I mentioned that his interview with 60 Minutes. Obama, when he was senator, gave a speech before a historically black college on an anniversary of the Bloody Selma March. And he said that my generation, which he called the Joshua generation, has to get us the rest of the way there. MLK's generation, he said, the Moses generation, took us 90% of the way there. My generation has to do that 10%. Does that sound like the same guy who said racism is in our DNA? If we're 90% of the way there, and this is before you became president, didn't your presidency cut into that remaining 10% just a little bit? I mean, honestly, there's a sociologist at Harvard named Orlando Patterson. He's a Democrat. All sociologists are Democrat. If you can name one that's Republican, I'd love to see him or her. He said America is the least racist, majority white country in the world, has more opportunities. Blacks are more prosperous, healthier, better fed than any other country on the face of the earth, including all of the countries of Africa. So honestly, come on, work hard, stay focused, get an education. Sooner or later, bad things are going to happen. Someone's going to say something to you, but come on. I was in Euclid, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland, my 2nd or 3rd year when I was practicing law, so I must have been 28 years old. And I had just done a deposition with an orthopedic surgeon, and my opposing counsel and I were in front of the doctor's office just talking, and my opposing counsel was white. Car drives by. Euclid is almost all white. Car drives by very slowly, raggedy car, 4 or 5 teenage white guys in there. Hey, N-word, what are you doing in Euclid? The sun's about to go down, get out of here. And David, my opposing counsel, was shocked. He's, I said, David, they're cowards, they're punks. They wouldn't even stop. Here I am at Squire Sanders and Dempsey, making the equivalent of $150,000 a year, and these guys are driving a raggedy car, calling me an N-word, and I'm supposed to lose sleep? I don't think so. I don't think so. Doesn't work that way. Wrong guy.
This will be our final question.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a pretty difficult question for me to ask.
But you're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So I just have some sort of feeling that you and a lot of people in your family have been in a lot of situations where you look around the room and there's just not a lot of you there. There's just not a lot of people that you see that look a lot like you, and I just want to know how having a lot of experiences like that, like throughout your life, have affected the way you see yourself as a person and the way you see other people.
Does it affect you here?
Sort of.
In what way?
I don't know. It's just tough. Like, it's just difficult to feel like you have I don't know, the same connection with maybe the next person you see that, you know, greets you as, you know, you might someone that does look like you just because the way
I understand. How do you think Jackie Robinson felt?
Probably a similar way.
What did he do?
I mean, he kept playing.
Kept going. I was in Pepper Pike, which is a suburb of Cleveland once, and I was watching a concert. One of my favorite singers is Johnny Mathis. I mentioned Cleveland is about 50-60% black, but I would say that my girlfriend and I were the only black people in that building aside from the people that work there. And she mentioned it to me. And I said, I certainly hope that it doesn't bother Johnny. Didn't bother me. The door was open, $20 to come and see him. Nobody is stopping him. Nobody is stopping black people from applying here at Hillsdale. Nobody is stopping anybody from coming here if they get accepted. You did it. There's no reason why other blacks can't do it as well. By the way, you remember the S-hole comment that Trump made? What he said was that why are we bringing in all these people from S-hole countries like Haiti and like countries in Africa? Do you know Obama said something very similar? Nobody said jack. Get an article, The Atlantic, I think it's May 2016. Article about Obama's foreign policy frustrations. And he was talking about how frustrated he was that he couldn't help to bring peace to the Middle East. And he said, and this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close, if everybody over there thought the way Scandinavians did, all of this would be easy, end of quote. Isn't Norway a Scandinavian country? If everybody in the Middle East thought the way Scandinavians did, all this would be easy. How is it any different than Trump saying, why are we bringing in people from S-hole countries like Haiti and like those from Africa? Both of them were making a value judgment about the culture of a particular country. In fact, Obama was making a value judgment about two countries, two areas, Middle East and Scandinavia. Nobody said a word. He also referred to Libya as a blank show. And he wasn't just talking about the fact that they had a civil war. He also talked about tribal divisions. So he too was making a cultural statement about the inferiority of a country also in Africa known as Libya. Nobody said a word. Trump says something. Oh my goodness, let's bring out the pitchforks. It's Trump derangement syndrome. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate it.